Hello, everyone. It's nice to see everyone. I just want to make a note about the recording here. So we're recording this for the center website. Are there any people who are uncomfortable with being in the video and who would rather not be recorded? Okay, that's good to know. You also don't want to be recorded from behind, or?
Behind's fine.
Behind's fine? Okay.
To Iran in December, so.
Sure, okay. Same.
Switch spots?
There's one spot in the back, if I'm really sorry to have to relegate you there, but I think it's going to be a little difficult to keep the frame very sort of close on us. Yeah. And if it's, and please, if there's anybody else, please let me know and we can kind of either rearrange the seating or come up with some other ideas.
Sorry.
It's all right, yes. You sure? Yeah? Okay, and you're definitely, sorry?
Is it a wide, will it?
It's not super wide, but I think it's going to be like, you know, the heads there are going to be in the picture and just around here. So thank you all for being here. And if you have a question and you don't want your voice to be in there, you're welcome to sort of, you know, send us a piece of paper or something. But it's all going to be just from behind, obviously. And it's going to be sort of the closer frame here. Thank you all for being here. My name is Nahim Siamdoust. I'm an assistant professor in Middle East and Media Studies in the Department of Middle Eastern Studies. And this is the first talk of a new series that we have here at the department. It's called Middle East Today. And in these talks, we will be engaging more deeply with current affairs. And we're happy to get feedback from the student and faculty body as well. If there are any issues that you would really like to see some, contemporary engagement with, engagement by experts, scholars, please write to me. I'm running the series. We'll have about 2 talks a semester. And just to engage, again, more deeply with current affairs issues rather than strictly sort of academic or scholarly issues. And I would like to introduce Dr. Mikia Koyagi, who is a professor of history here at the department. And I think he's going to start the talk with some introductory remarks before I then give the talk.
Okay. Okay, hi everybody. So thanks for coming to this first talk of the series, led by Dr. Nahim Siamdoust. So the topic for today's lecture is the ongoing protests in Iran. It has been going on for about a month, but the incident that led to these series of protests we see now started with the death of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Iranian woman who was visiting Tehran from Kurdistan with her family. And as you might have read in various media outlets, she was arrested for not wearing the hijab properly, and under police custody, she was hospitalized, and she eventually passed away on September 16th of this month. And although Iranian authorities have denied police brutality of Mahsa Amini, her death sparked massive series of protests in Tehran and in other cities as well. And Dr. Nahim Siamdoust is going to contextualize this ongoing protest in kind of larger historical context today. There are so many contexts to talk about, and we hope to cover, as many topics as possible. But we can think of, the sort of a longer trajectory of women's struggles over bodily autonomy and legal equality since the 1979 revolution, the trajectory of sort of demands for fundamental political change in the political system of the country, particularly after the 2009 Green Movement, and then the global entanglement of the current protests, particularly with the Iranian diasporic communities, and the role of new media technologies. And there are all sorts of interesting topics we have to talk about today. But I'm going to introduce Dr. Nahim Siamdoust very quickly. So Dr. Nahim Siamdoust is an assistant professor in the Department of Middle Eastern Studies. She's currently working on her second book project on the role of media technologies in the constitution of poetic world makings amongst post-1979 Iranian publics. And she has also extensive professional background in journalism prior to her academic career. And she has frequently appeared in various English, German, and Iranian media, including the New York Times Foreign Policy, Der Spiegel, and Jadaliyya. Dr.
Thank you so much, Dr. Koyagi. Okay, what I want to do today is, I want to sort of get a feel for the room. I think some of you, probably not very much different, not unlike me, perhaps have spent a lot of sort of sleepless nights over the last 6 weeks engaging with what's going on in Iran. Others perhaps haven't, just are here to sort of find out really what is happening in Iran. And whoops, I just lost the screen. So I think what I'm going to do is, given that this has been such an iconic movement, I'm going to lead us through, I think I might need Kelly because I can't figure out if this is going to happen. Let me see. Nope. Sorry, everyone, the usual tech difficulties. I'm honestly not sure how to do this. Hey, Kelly, thank you.
What happened?
I'm not sure, just sort of, I think my laptop maybe went to sleep, or the computer here went to sleep.
I'll log in.
So what I'll do is I'll lead us through some of these sort of iconic moments of the protests so far, sort of just so we have a grounding, a foundation from where then we can start to talk about the events, and hopefully leave enough space and enough time for all of us to just discuss the various aspects of these recent protests, some of which Dr. Koyagi referred to, but it's been a very fascinating movement to watch, both in terms of its gender aspects, but also in terms of generational questions, the role of media, and many different sort of the ethnic, aspects of these protests. And so I'll start by leading us through some of these moments. And what I'm starting with, and you're not seeing that yet, but quite soon, let's see, is, yes. Here we go. Thank you so much, Bye. Kelly. Bye. And it should be fine as long as I'm kind of working it, right? Yeah. Okay. So if we were to point to, point to a starting point of these protests, there's been some discussion about this on social media, and I tend to agree with it. I wouldn't, as instrumental as the death of Mahsa Jina Amini was to these protests really sort of igniting and starting, there's been some debate on social media saying, don't forget Sepideh Rashno and what happened to her about a month before the protests happened, in part because this really epitomized sort of the state-society relations in post-revolutionary Iran, where the state, through its state media, tries to present a certain, put a certain framing or spin on events that happen despite people's, intelligence and understanding and perceptions of what really is going on, right? But always trying to sort of impose its ideology and force people into confessions and apologies on state television. And this is deeply humiliating and undignified. And so about a month before Mahsa Jina Amini was killed, this woman was on a bus. She had an altercation with this other woman because there was a woman who had let down her headscarf, which has actually been a more sort of, current occurring across Tehran and other big cities where, this is something we don't see being in the West and consuming Western media, which is that, women across sort of really busy, crowded urban centers, but especially also in the better parts, in the better to-do parts of, well-to-do parts of Tehran, have kind of let their headscarves slip. So visually, we've already seen sort of women starting this, I guess what, Asaf Bayat would call a non-movement, right? Not a organized sort of movement, but through certain ordinary, everyday acts, pushing certain boundaries and making certain things a reality, right? And so a woman didn't have her headscarf on. This woman got involved and said, I'm going to have you arrested by the Sepah, by the Revolutionary Guard. Put on your headscarf. Sepideh Rashno gets in there and says, who are you to tell her what to do? This leads to an altercation. She ends up biting her wrist, and ultimately, because this got mediated on social media so much and went viral, this video of this altercation went viral with people taking positions on, the kind of enforcement of state ideology through people like her. State media decided to make an example of Sepide Rashno, who's got, photos of herself without hijab on her social media platforms. She's an artist and a writer, really sort of presenting her on state television, apologizing to her, and in what others subsequently, interpreted as her having been abused in some form, physical, mental. She did not appear to be sort of her full self when she appeared on state television, and so people talked about this abuse. So when about a month later, Mahsa Jina Amini was killed in morality police detention, there was already this discourse happening in the undercurrent of sort of social media, discussions which are very vibrant and lively in Iran, of this kind of humiliation of Sepide Rashno, and the issue of hijab has been a big one for the last couple of years, if not a little more. And I won't have time to really engage deeply with sort of the issue of hijab and who's been driving it and the campaigns, and it's another sort of important aspect of these protests to talk about, obviously. But when Mahsa Jina Amini was killed, there was her parents engaged in discussions about this. What made this case even worse? Not only was she a Kurd just visiting Tehran for a few days, and there are of course notions of guests and hospitality that run very deep in Persian culture. So there she is, a Kurdish person visiting Tehran and her relatives, and within short order she is killed. There were also discussions because there were this CCTV footage of her in detention, where she's wearing this long black robe, long black veil. She looks pretty impeccably dressed by today's standards of hijab, okay? So she's not even really that badly dressed. And so there are discussions of, okay, so if it can happen to her, it can happen to anybody, right? Sort of this regime discourse of trying to force these bad girls into abiding by certain codes of morality and standards of morality. Of course, the majority of Iranians have not bought that for a very long time, but it was so evident on the body of Mahsa Jina Amini. The fact that she was Kurdish was very important, and so when the first protest started in Kurdistan was deeply engaged and is still very much active in the ongoing protests, whether it's Saqqez, where she's from, a border city, or Sanandaj. And on her gravestone, her parents, clearly saw that already within a couple of days after her death, that she would become a symbol of something much greater. And so Jina Dir, it says in Turkish, you will not die, your name will turn into a symbol. And in fact, it has. And the significance of her being Kurdish and the first demonstrations happening in Kurdistan were that at her gravesite, the slogan Jinjian Azadi, Zan Zindagi Azadi, Woman, Life, Liberty, started to be chanted. This is a slogan that comes from the Kurdish women's liberation movement. It's about 15 years old, basically. It had a lot of recurrence again in Kurdish militia, all women's militia fighting ISIS in Syria. It was very much chanted there. And so this chant all of a sudden really comes to embody a movement that's been going on in Iran for, let's say, about 150 years or so. In 1852, the women's right advocate and Baha'i rattled was assassinated, and was killed for having unveiled in public. And at her killing, execution, she said, you can kill me as soon as you want, but you won't be able to stop women's emancipation. So there are these precedents in Iran of women fighting for their rights. Of course, the 1979 revolution, Iranian women were just as much engaged in the revolution and the protests as men were. They did not. Soon after the revolution, Khomeini came in and he said, women have to cover up in the ministries. And this caused the biggest post-revolutionary demonstrations just a month after the revolution in March, where thousands and thousands of women stormed the streets for 7 consecutive days and called for their rights. And yet these political groups and these Iranians who had just unseated one of the most powerful regimes in the world, right? The regime of Muhammad Reza Pahlavi, backed by the United States. They said, you know, what's more important is this anti-imperialist movement that we've had, and we have just succeeded. Women's rights are secondary. We'll get to that, okay? Just you guys calm down. We'll get to that. The hijab is not that important. And indeed, the hijab ended up being enforced, and it's been 4 decades of, I would say, about 2-3 decades of Iranian women sort of buying into that or acquiescing or not fighting it too much, in part because there was an Iran-Iraq war. There were all kinds of other battles to fight. The reform movement was going on. So yes, maybe there were more important things like custody and divorce rights and all these things that they had to fight for. Not only that, the issue of hijab is, of course, deeply contested because it's always the issue that is held up in sort of Western discourse, right? It's a contested, difficult issue. And so Eastern feminists don't really like to engage with sort of, the issue of hijab becoming central to women's rights. And so for about 3 decades or so, women kind of didn't push too much against it. I would say, the fight against, the activism against the hijab has really been on the go over the last, let's say, 7-8 years, and much more so over the last 2, 3, 4 years. But ultimately, what we've come around to is this notion, already recurrent in Iranian history and politics, and really encapsulated in this slogan that no one will have their liberty unless women have liberty, right? There won't be liberty for anybody unless women are also given the right to full freedom. And so this slogan really perfectly encapsulates that, and that's why it has become so central to this movement. When you listen to interviews with people in Iran, younger people, but also this sort of cross-generational, it's, people refer to how the first time they heard this slogan, it all of a sudden was like, that's it. Like, it just instantly made so much sense to them that this should be the slogan of this movement. Because as long as women are repressed, as long as women are not allowed to live the lives that they imagine, well, everybody else will be infantilized and patronized as well. And so that's at the core of the slogan. I've got this image up because it was one of the early images that really showed the not only the magnitude of the protests, but also, if it was, if this was a classroom, I'd call out, and I want to kind of move quickly. But as you see, it's a peaceful movement. It's men and women holding hands, but also we already see this sort of amassed sort of state security system having a face-off with protesters. It's not clear yet where this shall go. This was very early days, but already sort of symbolized the magnitude of these protests. And of course, what happened soon after is we saw lots of gatherings around fires, people chanting. Ms. Dr. Koyagi kind of referred to my research being about mediated publics in post-revolutionary Iran, and I write about these dance videos that we've seen come about on social media over the last few years, and how they've already been this sort of rehearsal of performing in the public space, this sort of untethering of bodies from state forces and state imposition and state ideology, and this, what we now frame as, a movement for women's autonomy, the autonomy of their bodies, right? And so this became, these kinds of videos went viral of women dancing around fires, throwing their headscarves into bonfires. This one in particular was an early one. It was in the Caspian city of Saudi. This one went viral in part because of the very defiant gesture of the woman in white who circles the fire and then throws her headscarf to the fire. I'm going to see if this video is going to play. It's a little small on the screen. Anyway, I've written about sort of the, this movement that I've talked about in New Lines magazine. If you'd like to look it up, just sort of more, a little deeper into the history of women's movements, though still concise and short because it's for a news publication. And then, of course, Baraye, the anthem of the protest movement. Shervin Hajibur wrote it about a week or two after the death of Mahsa Jina Amini. He posted it on his Instagram page on the 27th of September. And instantly it became the anthem of this protest movement. And when you look at these lyrics, this song has now been covered by dozens of artists in different languages. There have been all kinds of dance performances to it. In Berlin on Saturday, where the biggest Iranian diasporic demonstration took place, with something like 80,000 participants, according to the German police, this song was played over and over again. We're now also seeing kind of slightly, we're seeing the song all over the place in fashion shows in Milan and here and there, where women are sort of, symbolically cutting their hair to this song. But I write about this song actually in a piece that's coming out tomorrow on foreign policy, just sort of on the foreign policy publication website, just engaging a little deeply with why this song came to be the anthem of the protest movement and what about it really sort of encapsulates this movement. And I think what it is aside from, these sort of, universal desires, is really its specificity, right? This song is written based on a Twitter hashtag trend of Iranians themselves writing what they're on the streets for, what this protest movement is for. So the lyrics are not written by Shervin Hajipur. He's just taken them. The lyrics are written by Iranians at large. He's put it together into a song, beautifully vocalized it with all the pain and affect that comes through him singing it as an artist. And all these verses that you see here, they stand for if it's not a general thing such as the polluted air and this and that, they're verses that people instantly can identify with, such as, for the image of this repeating again. Here we see Hamid Esmailion, whose daughter and wife were killed in the shooting down of the Ukrainian airliner after Qasem Soleimani was assassinated in Iraq by the U.S. forces, by a U.S. drone. The Islamic Republic Revolutionary Guard basically shut down this airliner and killed everybody on board. And Hamid Esmailion became the face of everybody who had anybody on this plane, but also sort of, all those Iranians who've been pained by the experience of their families being split apart because of the lack of opportunities for Iranians, for well-skilled, well-educated Iranians. And so, Iranians must be some of the most split apart sort of, people on earth, because it has the biggest brain drain in the world. I'm not sure that still competes with Ukraine since Ukraine's happened, but certainly before Ukraine, Iran had the biggest brain drain, well-educated, highly skilled Iranians all trying to get out of Iran for simply sort of being able to live a good life, and other such verses. And of course, when we look at the verse in the song "For an Ordinary Life," actually, I was going to, I guess, maybe play this for. I'm sure you all have heard this by now. It's a very low volume. He was arrested the day after, or 2 days after he posted it on Instagram, and was kept for about a week and then let go and had to come out and issue an apology and take the track down from his Instagram page. But of course, the song is already all over the place. So, this idea of the state taking it down from his Instagram page just sort of points to the sort of incongruity of what the state is trying to do versus what people are already doing and have been doing for years, and the possibilities that they've carved out for themselves on social media, and the parallel lives that they've lived very openly and publicly, and the spillover from that life on social media into the actual and public spaces, right? Where certain things have been normalized and are no longer shocking on the street because people now have seen women sing solo on social media at the top of their lungs for years. People have seen women, without their headscarves dancing, doing all kinds of ordinary things. And so the reason this photo came to be so iconic was because this was taken by Donya Rad, who's the woman on the right. She's still in detention. She was detained a couple days after this photograph went viral. And, it's the most ordinary photograph, right? Two women eating kalle pache in Naziabad, which is in the south of Tehran, unveiled. But there are two reasons this photo is so significant. One is that it was actually taken in the south of Tehran. So again, we have seen women, wealthy Iranians and well-to-do take off their headscarves in restaurants. It's already very much a reality. And the police leaves them alone. There's money there. Chances are there are connections to the government there. And so those parts, those really well-to-do areas of Iran are sort of left alone. But it's sort of, Vanak, like mid to further downtown where these arrests of people are happening through the morality police. And so unveiling and having a most ordinary scene in an eatery was so revolutionary because of the absolute ordinariness and yet the impossibility of it, right? This is so ordinary and yet it's not possible in Tehran. And that kind of, is at the core of these protests and why this photograph went viral and caught people's imagination. Another iconic moment of the movements, the daughter who is at her mother's grave. Her mother was killed in the protests in Kermanshah, again early on, 20th of September, having shorn her hair, holding her long hair in her hand. And hair is a very symbolic, it's very symbolic in Persian literature, in the Shahnameh. It plays the role of expressing grief or beauty or love. And so sort of this, this historic, symbolic gesture being called forth into this very modern movement to express this deep grief and defiance against what's going on. And as we know now, women all over the world have, expressed their solidarity in cutting their hair to express solidarity with Iranian women. Another aspect of the protests that have been commented upon and certainly have become a central aspect of these protests is the very young age of the protesters, the fact that it's high schoolers and school kids who've been at the forefront of waging these protests, girls who are, expressing that gesture toward the country's founder, Khomeini, and its supreme leader, Khamenei, and photos of the teenagers who've already been, or very young women who've already been killed in these protests. And, this idea that this generation is no longer willing to accept what's been going on because they have come of age at a time when social media has very much been part of their daily lives. They are no longer willing to take the hypocrisy that comes with sort of this division between what their actual lives are like and what the state, through sheer force, forces them to do, right? Sort of the rejection of acquiescing to that and going along with that, which, Iran, social media have been very much part of Iranian lives, let's say for about at least 10 years, if not more. At the time of the Green Movement in 2009, they were already an important part of Iranian lives. But certainly for about a decade, and even before that, of course, there were other forms of media, right? Satellite television, DVDs, before that, VHS tapes. So Iranians had always had this alternative media universe where they had lived other kinds of lives and performed other kinds of lives. But social media made it so much more part of everyday daily life, to the point where this generation says, we're just not standing for this imposition anymore. Now, from this point onward, what I have is, a few photographs really just to point to very recent events, to point to the fact that these protests are very much ongoing. This is unlike the protests of, although I have to say the protests of Aban Khunin about two years ago, they also went on for a few months. But when these protests happened, everybody could tell something had really shifted, right? These protests were different from the 2009 movement for sure, because that was a movement for reform. But even from the protest movement of 2 years ago, and we can talk about that in the Q&A about what makes these protests so different from what we've seen before. In the case of Elnaz Rekabi, the champion rock climber who went to South Korea to compete and did it without a headscarf, again, was forced to come on state television and say it happened inadvertently. I just forgot my headscarf in the rush of getting ready for the competition. I forgot it. She was brought back to Iran. Top athletes in Iran have to sign pledges or legal documents that basically gives the government the right to confiscate their family's property if they don't return to Iran, because there have been many cases of athletes, top athletes, defecting. And so there's this real sort of pressure for athletes to return. She did return, but even when she returned at the airport, she was wearing a cap and a hoodie. She was not wearing the traditional headscarf. She was paraded on state television a few days, this is I think from 2-3 days ago, standing next to the Minister of Sport, again saying, I didn't do that intentionally. But the irony of this is that Iranians already know this script, right? The state is still engaging and continuing in this thing it's been doing for 40 years, right? Presenting lies on state television, forcing people into certain positions. The point is not for Iranians to necessarily believe it, right? The point is for the state to show that it has the force to do this, right? She's a champion climber, right? What does it take to be a champion climber? And yet she is forced by the state, and you can tell in her admission, she's deeply uneasy. She's very uneasy, saying it was inadvertent, I forgot it, it wasn't intentional, right? But the state can put on display that it can force people to do this. And I think that's something we need to consider. Now, everything I have from this point onward is actually from today. So these protests are ongoing. The Aban protests were the last big protests about 2 years ago. They were caused by, or they were ignited by the hike in fuel prices. They were interpreted as being very much about the economy. The rial had crashed by something like 60%. It's been a very downward slope. Back then, it was still acceptable very much to say because of extreme U.S. sanctions, which is true, and state corruption. But in many circles, if you say, extreme U.S. sanctions are to blame, you are now seen as being an apologist of the Islamic Republic. So that's another sort of aspect of these, protest movements and the discourses that are surrounding it that we need to discuss, and what's happened about, how do we get to discuss what's happening and who's allowed to speak, what kinds of arguments are allowed into that sort of space of discussion and what are not. But anyway, 2 years ago, they were caused by that. So the month of Aban, which just started yesterday in the Iranian calendar, is an important month. Many people, the numbers are still very much contested, but hundreds of people, young people, were killed in the Aban protests. And so when leading up to Aban yesterday, there were already chants about how, Khamenei, watch out, Aban is coming. Aban is the month of blood. You're going to be finished in Aban. Today is the second day of Aban. And what we see here is the spokesperson for President Ebrahim Raisi going to the Khaja Nasir University to sort of have dialogue with the students. For those of you who are sort of into this and are looking things up, Alireza Eshraqi wrote a piece in Merit Middle East Report online, I think it's what the acronym stands for, wrote a very good piece about how the Islamic Republic for 4 decades has had this notion of guftegu. Let's have dialogue, let's talk, we can sort this out. In very public ways, on state television, right? Bringing in people from different factions. It's still doing that now. It's bringing in reformists who are still considered to be kind of khodi, to be part of the inner circle, even if they're no longer allowed to stand for elections or anything, but who aren't totally sort of, outside of the permitted circle of the Islamic Republic, bringing them in even though they have different viewpoints and engaging them in these dialogues. But what Eshraqi also writes about is that, this is what Iranians have tried for 40 years, right? To have dialogue. I mean, the 2009 Green Movement was about reforming the system from within. It was very much reflected in the slogans that we heard. They were still using state discourse. They were still using Islamic references. They were going to their rooftops and shouting Allahu Akbar. Now, there's none of that. The only thing being shouted from rooftops is death to the dictator, death to Khamenei. And so this is an instance from today, Monday, in Tehran, of the spokesperson going and trying to talk to students, and what they're shouting, they don't even let him speak. What they're shouting is, "System fasid nemikhayem, mehmun qasid." We don't want a corrupt system. We don't want a guest who's a murderer. Let me see if I can play it. So, I mean, they didn't let him speak. And at Sharif University, Tehran today, they're saying, we'll fight, and we'll take Iran back. So these scenes were happening all over different universities in Iran today. I happen to have two from Tehran today, but here on this slide, but it's been all over. This one's from Shiraz. They're saying, and in the slogans you see reverberated sort of this unity among the different ethnic minorities, and also the, I guess, ethnic majority being the Persians. Sanandaj, Zahedan, Cheshmo Cheragh Iran. So they're referring to the capital of Kurdistan, and Zahedan of Baluchistan, and saying you are the shining lights of Iran, because they have been at the front line of some of these protests. And as Shiraz to Kurdistan, from Shiraz to Kurdistan, Iran has become a cemetery. So really sort of trying to bring in references of the different regions and ethnicities of Iran who are all part of what's happening here. And some of these, as you can tell, some of these videos they're intentionally blurry. They're calling for political students to be freed. Lots of students have been arrested at this point, hundreds of students, and so they're asking for students to be released. The next slide that I have is of the mothers of Aban. I'm going to play this whole video of the mothers who are still grieving their children who were killed in the Aban protests of 2 years ago. The reason I have this slide up, not only because of its of the importance of mothers asking for accountability for the murder of their children, is that mothers and women have actually been at the forefront of protests for years. And we see this when we look at the mothers of Park Lale, who gathered there for years to ask for accountability for the state of the murder of their kids in the Green Movement uprising. We see this when women are pushing to be let into the stadiums, and the death of one of those activists who set herself on fire when she realized that she would be given a fairly harsh sentence simply for her attempts to get into the stadium. We see this both sort of politically, on the political front, women pushing for all kinds of rights and ways to achieve things. The girls of Revolution Street, who already 3 years ago held their headscarves in the air and created these waves of people taking off their headscarves and putting them on stakes. But also, importantly, I think, not just on these sort of political fronts, but also sort of in the sphere of poetic and political imagination of women, again, sort of freeing their bodies from these restrictions and dancing on the streets, these sort of viral videos, micro video clips of women dancing, circulating. And so really sort of in the imaginary space, because to have a revolution, you need to have the imagination. And I would say, women have been at the forefront of creating that kind of imagination for the moment that would come beyond or after the Islamic Republic. Let me see if I can play this.
دومین سال روز بچه همونه، بچه های آبان سیاه، بچه هایی که توی یه شب سرد سیاه تاریک وسط خیابون پرپر شدن. به راحتی 2 سال مادران داغخواه فریاد میزنن قاتلین بچه های ما کی هست؟ کی بچه های ما رو کشته؟ به چه جرمی بچه های ما رو کشتی؟ و هیچ کس جوابگوی ما نبوده. و اتهام داشتیم چون میگی کی بچه‌مو کشته مجرمیم. پرونده هاتون سنگینه چون مادریم، چون دادخواهیم. سکوت کنیم. ولی امشب به یاد تمام کشته شده های آبان ما خانواده های آبان دور هم جمع شدیم، شمع روشن کردیم، گل پرور کردیم به یاد پرور شده های آبان سیاه که به کل دنیا بگیم ما نه میبخشیم نه فراموش میکنیم و تا انتقام خون به نحق ریخته بچه هامون رو نگیریم هرگز به هیچ عنوان آروم نمیگیریم. و بازم میگم شما خودتون میدونید با آبان نابود شدید و این آبان تا انتقام به بچه هامون ادامه داره.
These mothers associations again have been going on for at least 12, 13 years now. And the other thing I want to point to is, again, I pointed to the political and poetic imaginary of what's going on. And something we see in these protests is the incredible sort of aesthetic dimension of these protests and the artistic creations that have happened during these protests, whether it's poster art, whether it's cartoons, whether it's videos, whether it's performative acts. I have Mohsen back in the room who's helping me archive and collect some of these. And it's the balloons being sort of spread into the sky. Dictator Aban, Salam Khan, dictators say hello to the month of Aban. This is your end. And this one, of course, is very evocative because it's Mahsa Jina Amini and Mina Shakiri, who she was 16 years old. She was also killed in the protests. And they're much later, after she died, after she was killed, Mahsa Amini's video was released where she's singing this Gugush song. Part of the lyrics are Hamsadai khubam bekhun ta bekhunam, my beautiful co-vocalist, sing so I may sing. And so it's very evocative of this movement of people joining forces, not least because, of course, women's voices have been silenced, not just figuratively, but also literally, right? Solo female singing is not permitted in post-revolutionary Iran. And so the artistic work that's happening around this is it says a simple performance, but very good. A woman putting down her chair in the middle of the street in Tehran and simply brushing her hair, literally just sitting there and brushing her long hair. And so these have been very current. And we can talk about, there have been a lot of solidarity statements from women all over the world, very strong ones from the women of Afghanistan, Sudan. There have also been some kind of, cautious statements of solidarity, in part because, of course, for some women and people around the world, there's this question of what is this? Is this an anti-Islamic or anti-hijab protest movement? What's going on here? There's a bit of unease involved for especially hijabi women, right? But of course, this is not an anti-Islam or anti-hijab movement, and we see in many of these protest videos and pictures women who are in full, chadors and in headscarves. This is a question of choice and liberty and freedom from state impositions, right? And that's another sort of issue that we can discuss. And I'm going to leave you with to honor the children who've been dying on the streets, the young women who've been killed on the streets, protesting and really asking for very basic things. I'm going to end with a video montage that somebody put together of Sarina Ismailzadeh, who was 16 and killed in the protests. And she had started vlogging in January. So there's lots of sort of video footage of her. Just sort of narrating her day-to-day life. This is what I'm doing, this is that. And so somebody took these and put them together to speak sort of from in her own voice about what kinds of things was she aspiring for, and what kind of life was she seeking. And this is our last slide, and then we can have the discussion afterwards. It's a little low on volume. I'm sorry about the audio, but hopefully you guys can see the translated subtitles.
مردم یک کشور چه انتظاری میتونن داشته باشن به کشور خودشون؟ رفاه نه چیز دیگه. وضعیت اقتصادیمون داغونه، فرهنگیمون داغونه، اصالتمون داغونه. این هم 20 سال پیش نیستش که ما جوانی همسن خودمون تو ایران هیچ کس دیگه رو نداشتیم. نه، ما اون کسی که یه چوبی داره از برداشتگی میره هم میریم، اونی هم که تو بین عشق خودش هم میکنه رو میریم. و خب همونجایی هم که انسان کمالگراست همیشه به اون خوبه نگاه کنه و میخواد بشه اون خوبه. آزادی is loading.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Siamdoust, for a really illuminating presentation. So we're going to open up the floor for Q&A. But before I open the floor, I'm going to take advantage of my position and ask a few questions. One is related to the question of the particularity of this moment of 2022, because especially after 2009 and the Green Movement, we have, in the last 5 years or so, we have seen so many protests, series of protests, rooted in some sort of material concerns, whether it's about the cost of living or the water management issue. So all these questions, material specific questions, some of them grow into massive ongoing protests. And as you have kind of alluded throughout the talk, it's about the hijab, but it's also more than about the hijab, right? So what do you see in this change of discourse at this particular moment of 2002 in comparison with, say, 2009 or 2019-20? So that's the first question. And the second question is about the question of like who participates in these protests, right? Because you talked about the cross-generational aspect of these protests, and we often characterize these movements, through the lens of sort of a kind of urban middle-class young people taking the lead. But at the same time, we have a much wider sort of participation, right? If you look at the victims from a protest, you see people from pretty tiny provincial towns killed in those places, and people in the 50s and 60s are also part of the victims, right? So could you tell us a little bit more about this heterogeneity of the participants and their sort of the points where they converge, what points they might diverge? Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I think on your first question about, what makes these protests different, that's something that's still being studied and analyzed by everybody, and it's a very fascinating thing to consider. So I think you will hear possibly different perspectives on this question from different, analysts and thinkers on this. My own perception of it is that, the Islamic Revolution, or if we should refer to it as the 1979 revolution, was actually a very hopeful, incredibly sort of, utopian movement that happened in 1979, right? It was a movement for freedom and democracy and all these things. And I think a lot of Iranians were deeply invested in it. Sure, Khomeini took over, it became an Islamic Republic, and the repression started soon after. But I think ultimately, there were people invested enough in this revolution to try to make it work. And we see this, all the way to the Green Movement, where the reformists are at work trying to bring about real changes from within. There's even a period of time where the parliamentary is a majority, reformists, and the president is President Khatami, and there's the spring of newspapers, toward the late 1990s and early 2000s, where there is actually this flourishing of media and open debate and discussion. And the reform movement had many champions, people trying to really change things from within. Those hopes were dashed in 2009. I was a reporter working on the Green Uprising in 2009. And in retrospect, it seems quite naive. But, when we look, and I think a lot of these discourses that are happening now are kind of almost atemporal. They don't take into consideration that, 10 years ago, we were in a different part of the process in achieving, democracy and freedom in Iran than we are now. At this point, it's almost like the cards have all been revealed. People have tried long enough. They've tried all kinds of different ways in bringing about reforms, and they haven't really succeeded at all. Not only that, the Islamic Republic has become more and more authoritarian, has securitized the public space more and more, limited the options within elections to basically only its own choices, like deeply engineered elections so that you get somebody like Ebrahim Raisi as president versus, when the option of Khatami was still on the table. None of the previous reformist candidates can run even for elections anymore, right? I mean, Mir Hossein Mousavi is under house arrest, a bunch of them are in prison, and the ones who are free, they can't run. They're no longer qualified by the very system which they led, right? So my own understanding of it is that, the reason this movement is mature is because it is not an overnight thing. I really think Iranians really tried hard for 4 decades to bring about changes from within. From the outside in diasporic communities, they will say, some of them who've been abroad for 30, 40 years have been saying the mullahs are corrupt, there will never be any kind of change, we knew this from the beginning. There are a lot of discourses like that. So anybody who's even arguing that, the movement for reforms was a, valid movement at one point is shut down as being an Islamic Republic apologist. But my own understanding is, it's come to a point where reforms are completely dead. It's now very clear that all elections are completely engineered. There's no room for reform. There's this, divide that I referred to, which is the absurdity of the kinds of lives that Iranians would like to live and what they're supposed to live and what they're held to, and hence these, confessions and apologies that are deeply humiliating and denigrating and go against, reality, right? And I think, the reason this song is also so popular is because you can see in the verses, throughout the verses, that the Islamic Republic is basically being painted through the very words of Iranians themselves. This is not one person writing the lyrics. This is the lyrics of many, many people, right? As a system that is fundamentally against life, against laughing, against dancing, against an ordinary life. I think all these things have kind of just percolated and come to a head with the killing of Mahsa Jina Amini. And I think, again, the fortuitous sort of linking of this revolutionary Kurdish slogan and its adoption into the Persian space has really helped propel that movement and clarify its identity, right? What is at stake here? And Iranians have seen women being at the forefront of these movements for at least a decade, right? Very much so. Like if you look at the campaigns that have been caught, and so I think there's some kind of switch has happened, where this is. I was talking to Dr. Aghai before, and he was saying he's a professor of history in this department. I don't know if he was. And he was saying, this is very much like, it strikes him like the French Revolution, where, the whole state discourse is appended. People are not engaging with that discourse anymore. Things have turned. This is no longer about let's bring out reform, or, I think Rob Malley said today that this is the, what's the Iranian, what do they call them? Anyway, the person in the State Department who's responsible for Iran, he was saying, Iranians are out there asking for the government to accept and recognize their humanity. That is not what Iranians are asking. They are not talking to the state anymore, right? The protests that we see, they're not asking the state for anything. They're asking for the state to disappear for this state, right? This is different. This is different from 2 years ago in the dimensions of it. And you talked about in your second question about the generational aspect of it. The fact that, and I think there's something, somebody in a different talk asked, well, who do you think is leading this movement, or where do you think this might be going? And I don't think anybody knows. All I know is that we are learning from teenagers who are on the streets calling us out for not calling us out, but just saying, end this acquiescence, right? We no longer want to put up with this. So who's going to be leading this movement? I don't think it's clear at all. There are, of course, people in the opposition who claim leadership. But at the moment, I think maybe we will learn a different kind of revolution through this very uprising that's happening in Iran. Not a very satisfying answer, but I think it's kind of, something that's very much evolving and developing. Yeah.
I'm curious, do you think after all of this, though, that the protests will fizzle out? Because that I feel like would be the worst outcome possible, and I'm afraid that that's probably the most likely outcome.
Why do you think that's the most likely outcome?
Because that's how it's always been. Anything hasn't really come out of, or nothing has really come out of all of these protests, before and now, it seems like.
Yeah, I know. I kind of hit that point sometime last week, and but I'm not so sure these will fizzle out, because I think the nature of the protests are different. If they do fizzle out, you're right, that is the worst outcome, because then we know no matter what, right, no matter what people do, no matter how young the protesters on the street are, they will be quashed and they will be put down. And I think you're right, given the radical nature of these protests, if these are put down, then probably nothing can really succeed, at least in our short-term imagination or even longer-term imagination. I'm not sure yet. I'm just not sure, because I'm seeing, of course, the internet's more or less completely cut down. People have about 2 to 3 hours of internet every day. It's random. They don't know when they have access. So they, if they send a message on WhatsApp and they see it go through, they realize, okay, I've got internet. So the thing that might be hindering that is, I guess, the fact that we outside of Iran actually know more about what's going on and these protests than Iranians themselves. This is something that somebody from Iran was telling me. She was like, so what's going on? Tell me what's happening in Iran, because I'm cut off. I don't know, unless I can't, go around and see what's happening, and I don't have internet. But despite of that, I could have shown you something like 40 videos. I showed you just 2 or 3 of what happened today. 40, 50, 60. There's so many. You must be, I don't know, monitoring them too, perhaps. But yeah.
So that kind of like the status quo before and during the protest. Like I noticed a lot of the videos, like some girls walking out with a hijab and stuff. So like, are they being arrested for protesting for not wearing hijab? Is it like a random, so some people can get away without wearing hijab, or is it normal for a lot of girls to not wear hijab? Like what exactly? Like I'm sure like when it's posted on social media, that's when it becomes like a bigger deal because it's a movement. But how is it like on a day-to-day basis?
It is a bit random. So if these women are, so we see lots and lots of women just walking around without their headscarves now. In some instances, then we see videos of security people really beating them up badly, and women being injured and taken to hospitals and arrested. In many cases, that's not happening. However, it's only because the forces are kind of stretched, trying to hold down. Today there was a huge protest at a girls' high school, girls' arts high school, Madrasa Sadr, and there you could see there were something like 40 or 50 security people trying to sort of encircle the school. And so they can't monitor everything at all times. They don't, they have a very, very large force, but I think people are still able to get away with doing things because they can't afford to, shut every single woman down who's putting down her headscarf. That's why we're seeing these sort of random videos of extreme violence against some women who've got their headscarf down, and then dozens of videos of women walking around very defiantly without their headscarves, doing sort of performative acts of, sitting down on a chair on the street and brushing their hair. It's kind of in that, in that moment of, it's a very dynamic moment right now, right? Things are happening. It's not, everybody's just watching, and a lot of people are doing, but it's just very evolving and dynamic right now. Yeah.
So, this seems like a very crucial time for Iran at the moment too, because I feel like a few weeks ago there were rumors that Khamenei had died. I'm not sure if those rumors have been corroborated, but so you have all these you also see all these narratives kind of that have previously been unsuccessful, latch on to or use this as kind of a vector for them to also make their voices heard. I wanted to know if what are the other prevailing narratives that you reference, the ethnic narratives as well, and if that holds any water, or if there's something else that people are not paying as much attention to.
I think as far as the narratives in Iran itself, there are a lot of places to watch. There are a lot of interweaving narratives among, the students have been very active. Labor unions have entered the fray, right? The oil refineries have tapped the sugar refineries. All of these are very important for the Iranian economy. Those laborers have entered the fray. And let me know if I'm not responding to your question. I'm trying to figure out exactly sort of what narratives to highlight. So people have really entered the fray. And however, some of the tribes, for example, of Iran have not yet entered the fray because the regime has successfully, either it has successfully managed to frame this to some people as being against against sort of morality and against hijab, or the heads, the sheikh, the shuyukh of those movements are invested in this system continuing. So there is this sort of, question mark around why are some of the Arab tribes, why are some of the, Alur tribes, why are some of the tribes and their tribal heads not entering the fray? So that's why I'm saying, it's still kind of a dynamic, the state has really tried to enforce this narrative that these are people who are, who are paid and driven by foreign discourses. These are people who are trying to spread immorality in the streets. Just today, somebody from the Sepah said, if it wasn't for the Revolutionary Guards, some of you women would be up for sale right now, just like the Yazidi women were in Syria and Iraq. So just trying to sort of spin this narrative that, still, I guess, has some purchase among some people. Yeah. Yeah.
Do we know how the Iranian government surveils its people?
Yeah. So we don't know exactly, but we do know they have a lot of cameras and CCTV cameras all over the place. We do know that they definitely surveil social media accounts. Certainly the ones of better known activists or people, and trying to figure out who's liking those comments, who are retweeting those comments, who are the people who are part of this conversation. So that kind of surveillance is happening. And it's not a super police state like other contexts, like the Syrian context that we know, not least because the Syrian context is much smaller. It's much easier. The state security and policing system is much harsher there. So Iran hasn't really traditionally been considered, that kind of police state where every person is surveilled. But certainly if you become active, if you make a name for yourself in social media, if you are involved in protests, they've talked about using visual identification technology now. So they've started doing that in some of these protests. I think the more protests there are, the better of a handle they have on the people who are part of it, and the better surveillance they have on their people, right? So there is definitely a cost involved. Even if you're not beaten or killed, there's definitely a cost involved with being involved.
And is there anything we can learn from other countries in the region who have gone through a revolution that was perhaps successful or not successful? Like I'm thinking about the Arab Spring, the Taliban taking over Afghanistan again, etc.
Well,
like, is there a comparison we can make, or is Iran just completely exceptional?
I mean, there's some comparisons that we can draw, but as we know, unfortunately, the only Arab country that was considered to have succeeded with its revolution in the Arab Spring, Tunisia, has now faltered completely to a very dictatorial president who changed the constitution to be even more dictatorial than it was before Ben Ali, whom they unseated during the Arab Spring. And none of the other Arab states were considered to have succeeded with their revolutions, right? In Egypt, Sisi, a military dictator, is in power, and other places, Syria, Assad stayed in power. Yemen is a disaster. So, in none of these places can we consider the revolutions to have succeeded. I think, however, the question is a good one because Iranians have their own example to draw on. They are the ones who had, one of the most, one of the greatest revolutions of the 20th century, right? And there are a lot of parallels, and people are drawing those parallels. They're saying, look, the oil refineries, the workers have joined the protests. This is happening. Look, there are all kinds of similes about martyrs, the martyrs of this movement. And of course, this is a very evocative sort of, symbology to the 1979 revolution and onward. Today there were several videos of people pulling down clerics' turbans, and how this is, reminiscent of people doing acts of, everyday acts of violence against people in military uniform during the Shah's government, toward the very end of the revolution. So they're drawing their own similes of how this revolution is moving toward, having some similarities to their own revolution 43 years ago. Sure. Yeah.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but basically the morality police are not really connected to the government. And that lady on the train who got hurt, it's the morality police could just be extremists in day-to-day life. And if it's those are the people that are killing Iranian women, it's how are we going to combat, if we're protesting the government, how are we going to combat the extremists that are at home, if that is what the actual threat is?
That's a good question. So the morality police is a force of the police. So they are completely institutionally part of the state security system. However, there are plainclothes people and, Basijis who have, who have taken on the mantle of purveying good and forbidding evil, Nayaz Munkar, in the public realm, right? And they were empowered a few years ago by the head of the Sepah saying, the head of the Basij saying, it's okay for ordinary citizens to go around and try to put people on the righteous path, right? That's why we see all these videos of men going around and telling women, I'm not, I'm not here to, put you in your place, but I'm here to educate you. Put on your hijab, woman, And so they've been empowered in the public space to go around and basically enforce the state's morality system on citizens. So it's a good question because you have both the organized institutional force, but you also have, Basijis and others who take it upon themselves and who've been empowered by the state's discourse and the Basijis, open statement to go around and do this kind of work. Yeah.
This is a question regarding, I'm Iranian American, so I previously was traveling back and forth to Iran, but now I feel, after posting so much about it, I would feel uncomfortable right now going. But my question is, how far do you think the wrath of the Iranian regime would go to potentially hurt or encumber somebody outside of Iran? So for example, we saw that with Jamal Khashoggi by the Saudis. So I don't know if the Iranian government would go that far, but is it in the realm of possibility? Somebody in Canada, they talk about there's potentially spies. Is this something that we as Iranian Americans should be worried about?
I think, there have been cases of the Islamic Republic assassinating political leaders and activists outside of Iran's borders. Most recently, of course, Mahsa Jina, there was a plot on her to be abducted to and taken to Venezuela, and from there onto Iran. They tried for years to get her to Turkey. From there, where they can easily abduct people and kidnap them to Iran. There was also the case of Zam, of the journalist Ruhollah Zam, who was very much involved in the information circles and activism of a few years ago. He actually was given promises of something in Iraq. He went to Iraq on his own volition and was there kidnapped and taken to Iran and executed. So I think, if you're somehow very active in the opposition and are very active against the Islamic Republic abroad, then you should definitely be concerned. But I think as everyday citizens who are, posting or taking part in protests, they simply can't. This is not their jurisdiction. The FBI and other, state security systems of those governments have an eye out on operatives of the Islamic Republic doing this kind of work, which is why, the kidnapping plot against Ali Najad was foiled by the FBI. It's. I think it's a question a lot of us, not the sort of, but I think a lot of Iranians, with these protests think that they can no longer go back because they felt a call to amplify the voices in Iran, right? They felt a call to take a position, whereas previously maybe we were a little more cautious because we traveled back to Iran. The situation kind of changed a bit, and now I think this affects a lot of Iranians in the diaspora. Yeah.
There's a question.
Go ahead. I wanted to ask a little bit more about exploring the role of social media for Iranian Americans, because it's kind of hard for me to conceptualize what my role is in terms of locally organizing and utilizing my social media platform. And so it's kind of difficult to talk about that and understand that, because I have parents that have very real fears of being targeted if I went back. I want to go back sometime this year, and that's very real. But just kind of understanding the risk with that is really difficult. But it was good that you touched on that. But also, do you see it being very useful for Iranian Americans to use their platforms, big or small, just like the average person, having conversations about what's going on, things like that? And also, do you know of any local organizing going on in support?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a sort of personal decision for everybody to make. I do think that, for example, it makes a difference when 80,000 people march in Berlin, right? It makes a difference when thousands of people across the world are amplifying the voice of Iranians, of children who are risking their lives on the streets, expressing solidarity with this movement. And so I think it matters. Now, does it matter if you post a couple of times a day, and is that posting having an impact, and is that worth the risk you're bringing to yourself? You know, I think it's kind of a personal decision to make on that one, but I feel you. I mean, I know that that's a really difficult sort of place for most Iranians to be right now. And then about local organizing, I have a feeling this room knows better than me, because I just moved to Austin and I'm not really sort of, and does anybody know about local organizing of protests here in Austin? Are they happening on a weekly basis, Saturdays at the Capitol, or?
There's one on, there's supposed to be one this Thursday or Tuesday?
Thursday.
Thursday.
Oh, Thursday. Okay. Is there a website or?
I'm not sure whether.
We were told by our professor.
Okay. Okay.
But it's Thursday at noon in front of Greg.
Okay. So maybe once you show up to one of these, it's easier to, yeah.
Yeah, can I connect with either of you just to be?
We have time for one more question. Does anybody have the final question?
In your opinion, countries like the U.S., how could they help this revolution, or should they even intervene?
Like, what could they do? You know, I mean, short of...
I think Iranian people are angry because they think they're helping Islamic Republic right now.
I know, there's a lot of conversation like that. Surely the protests have, you know, there were a lot of calls for the U.S. to stop negotiating on the nuclear issue with Iran, right? But the Biden government was still going on and trying to sort of see where that was going to go. Those negotiations seem to have come to a halt precisely because of these protests and the calls of Iranians, especially in the diaspora, saying, stop negotiating with the Islamic Republic, we don't want to deal. So they've kind of stopped on that front. And then, you know, there are calls for greater sanctions against officials of the Islamic Republic, which is warranted, absolutely. But then there's some people who are saying just greater sanctions in general, and those are opposed by many Iranians because, as we know, those affect ordinary Iranians much more than anybody else. And in fact, the regime has made a business out of, being the only ones who can still do financial transactions and provide certain kinds of goods in the situation of extreme sanctions. So those have actually helped a lot of people who are connected to the state. Short of that, I mean, nobody's calling for military intervention. Nobody wants that. Everybody saw that in Iraq. Total disaster. The U.S. is not there to, this is, more importantly, Iranians don't really need the U.S. I mean, when you look at what's been happening, right? They've been going on the streets and teaching the world a lesson, not just about Iran, right? The woman, life, liberty chant has now been adopted by all these movements across the world, because turns out this is not just an Iranian issue, right? This is an issue that a lot of other countries and peoples in the world are claiming as something that can bring real emancipation to their societies. I'm not saying this because I'm Iranian, but honestly, I think we're all learning from Iranians in Iran, right? And so I just don't think there's anything the U.S. could do for Iran, to be honest. I think it has to happen there, and they're doing it. And if it doesn't succeed, well, it was not going to succeed with the U.S., imposing more sanctions. The only thing would be drastic, which is like military intervention, and nobody wants to see that happen. So, yeah, Samir.
I'm sorry, it was supposed
Okay.
to be the last question. I'm just wondering, I think you touched on this bit in the beginning of your talk about, and I've seen certain examples from my own country coming, this association of the movement. We understand what hijab stands here and what its meaning really is, but it also feeds into Islamophobic understandings of the people who are not in Iranian context, people who are not Muslims, and who have certain idea of Islam. So they are also part of this revolution and cutting their hair on television and claiming to be standing for the rights of women when in their own country they're not doing it. So, and you said Islamist feminists are also sort of distancing themselves because of the meaning of the hijab. women who do wear hijab. So how do we understand these differences when certain cultural revolutionary movements get appropriated for the wrong reasons?
Yeah, I think I've been very, sort of divided on. I've seen some acts of solidarity of women cutting their hair, which are really truly inspiring and really appreciated. Then I see videos of people sitting in like the opera house in Milan and passing around a pair of scissors, and everybody's like cutting off a little piece of hair and passing on the scissors. And I'm like, what is this like, theatrical performance that has nothing to do with. And then, fashion shows where the models are running down the runway and cutting their own hair. I think there's something very potent in the symbology of women's empowerment, and there's certainly something Islamophobic in it, which people are cashing in on, and it's become part of some kind of commercial like thing where it's the cool cachet that makes you money, right, on runways and whatnot. So I think we have to be sort of judicious on which of these movements and which of these acts do we align ourselves with, and which do we kind of look at and think, okay, whatever, like you guys got a part of it too for the wrong reasons, but but thank you for that question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much all for coming to this inaugural event, Middle East Today, and we'll probably have one more.
The next one's gonna be, I think, sort of late January.
Okay.
Yeah, because this term is almost over, believe it or not. Yeah.
So there's going to be an announcement when we have next event scheduled. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Dr. Nahim Siamdoust.
Thank you everyone for your great questions.